All right, are we good to go here? All right, looks like it. All right, well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, How Clean Energy Makes Life More Affordable and How to Talk About It. I'm Trevor Melanson, Communications Director at Clean Energy Canada. If you don't know us, we're a think tank at the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, BC, located on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'm also joined today by our partners at the Canadian Climate Institute, Efficiency Canada, and Reclimate. I'll introduce my co-hosts momentarily. But first, I just want to do some quick housekeeping while folks are still connecting in. If you have technical questions, you can ask them through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. My colleague, Kira Torrance, will provide support. We'll be welcoming your questions in the final 30 minutes of this webinar. You'll be muted, however, so please submit your questions through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to ask a question at any time, and we'll be compiling them for later. Finally, we'll circulate a recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides to all who registered. Feel free to share them widely. We'll also include a link to Clean Energy Canada's awesome weekly newsletter, which you should totally sign up for if you haven't already. I'm biased. But now on to the fun stuff. So first off, nearly 700 people registered for today's event, which makes this the most popular webinar Clean Energy Canada has ever hosted. I'd credit teamwork as one reason for the big number. Our 4 co-hosting organizations all helped promote today's event, but I think the topic also sells itself. It's so obvious that affordability is the most salient issue in Canada that I'm probably wasting words even saying it. Affordability dominates every political poll, and I imagine many dinner conversations. It remains to be seen whether this rocky issue is one that we, as climate champions, can navigate to our benefit, but I personally like working backward from optimism. And there's one reason in particular that makes me optimistic, and that's that we have the truth on our side. Canadians really will spend less money on energy than they do today as we transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. So quickly, here's the International Energy Agency. So you can see families spend a bit more on electricity and a lot less on fossil fuels. And here is a brand new slide, a poll from Abacus Data on behalf of Clean Energy Canada. And you'll see here 63% of Canadians believe a family with an EV and a heat pump will spend less on energy. That's a start, but we have a ways to go. And the savings are likely greater than many of these folks realize. Now, we shouldn't underestimate the challenge before us. The way energy will be consumed and paid for will change, sowing some confusion. And certain families may find the process difficult without government assistance. And then there's the politics of it all. Transitions aren't without speed bumps. Lucky for us today, I'm joined by 4 brilliant people who are here to help. Over the past year in particular, a number of Canadian organizations have directed their research efforts toward this question of affordability and clean energy. My colleague, Jana Elbrecht, will kick us off with Clean Energy Canada's research into household energy spending in electric vehicles. Sarah Miller from the Canadian Climate Institute will walk us through their very timely research on heat pumps. Brendan Haley will speak to Efficiency Canada's work on this file, and they've been focusing on this stuff for years. And finally, Dr. Louise Comeau, representing Reclimate, will offer insight into how we bridge affordability and climate in our communications. Once more, I'm Trevor Melanson, and I'll see you in about 40 minutes with my colleague, Carrie McNamara, who will moderate the question panel. I'll now hand things over to Jana to get us started.
Thank you, Trevor, and thank you everyone for joining today. So as Trevor just mentioned, almost 2 out of 3 Canadians believe that a family adopting clean energy solutions at home would spend less on energy. So we decided to run the math, and this September we published a report called A Clean Bill, and we ran the numbers for Ontario. And I'll be telling you a little bit about those household comparisons that we did and the in-depth analysis about EVs we did. So I'll share some numbers that are not in the report for different provinces. So this is our setup. This is our comparison. These are two hypothetical households, both single detached family homes in the Greater Toronto area. Each of them houses 2 adults, 2 kids, and probably a dog. And the first house here, house number 1, powers their lives the way that many of us have done for decades. They have 2 gasoline-powered cars, 1 SUV, 1 truck. They heat their home with natural gas, they heat their water with natural gas, and they have a central AC system to keep their house cool in the summer. The other family here in house number 2, their neighbors, have gone all in on clean energy. So they have traded in their polluting cars for an electric Hyundai Kona and a Chevy Bolt, and they have gone completely off of natural gas. So they have a heat pump to both heat and cool their homes, and they also have their water heating and cooking electric. And what did we find? We found that the clean energy family saves $807 per month. And that adds up to almost $10,000 a year. And these days, you know, when many of us are seeing a rising cost of living, $10,000 a year is a good amount of money to spend on groceries, on a vacation, on literally anything else. We actually also included a third household in our analysis, and you can see that in our report, and that's a sort of in-between case. And we find that even by making some smaller changes, so swapping out 1 car for an EV and having a heat pump with natural gas backup, you can still save over $500 per month. So let's dive into the details and what these bills look like. We have here 1 column for energy costs and 1 for equipment costs. So equipment costs can be a car, a heat pump, a stove, and in each of these lines, each of these categories, we assume that the household is making a decision between a new gas car or a new EV, or between a new gas furnace and AC system versus a heat pump. And the equipment costs have been annualized. So there's a lot of numbers on this slide, but there's a few I want to point out. The first is that the biggest savings are in the vehicle category in this first line. And that is because fueling a truck or an SUV is expensive. So just trading in those gas cars for EVs saves a clean energy family hundreds of dollars a month in fuel and maintenance costs. And the second one is that a heat pump is a great cost saver in Ontario, but I'll leave that to Sarah to talk about because they graciously shared this heat pump data with us. And then when we look at the water heating and cooking categories, the third and the fourth line, we see that at first glance, these costs are pretty similar. But what you don't immediately see here is that by switching everything to electricity, the clean energy family can cut off their gas connection. And that saves them the monthly service charge, which in Ontario is $23. And we've reflected that in our heating bill here. Final thing I want to say about these bills is the last line, which is the climate action incentive payment, maybe more commonly known as the carbon tax rebate. And this is the rebate that is received by all households in provinces that are covered by the federal fuel charge. It is paid out quarterly, but for this 4-person Ontario household, it would translate to $81 a month. And actually, most families under the federal system end up getting back more as a rebate than they pay as carbon pricing. And this is especially true for a clean energy family, of course, because they don't end up paying a lot in carbon pricing, but they still get that full rebate. And we did a similar comparison for households living in condos in downtown Toronto. And these are 2-person households. And in this case, we said, what if you swap out your car and you rely on public transit? And as a carless Torontonian myself, I know that this is doable. You can live without a car in the city, and it saves you a lot of money. So we find that the condo clean energy family can save over $450 a month, which again adds up over $5,000 a year. But when we dive into the details of the energy bills, we see a bit of a difference with a single detached home. Again, the transport category is the biggest saver. And we also did run a case with trading in the small Toyota for an EV, and that would still save $183 a month. But public transit really is a big cost saver here. But we see in the other categories for the condo that the energy bills go down, but the overall bills don't go down yet. And that is because of equipment costs. And a real relevant point here is that not all rebates are available for people living in these types of buildings. So those were the savings for Ontario households, but we also have recently run the numbers for other provinces. And we actually find that in the Metro Vancouver area and the Halifax areas, savings are even greater. In Vancouver and BC, this is mostly due to the fact that gasoline is a lot more expensive. So an EV is a bigger cost saver, and the fact that there are good rebate programs at the provincial level as well, which help raise the savings. In Halifax, the savings are higher than in Ontario because energy prices are higher overall, both for electricity and for fossil fuels. And the clean energy family not only switches from fossil fuels to electricity, but they also get a lot of efficiency savings by adopting a heat pump and an EV. Efficiency savings means using less energy. And when energy is more expensive, that means higher savings. So these are some of our household numbers. And then, like I said, we did a more in-depth look into EVs, which turn out to be the biggest possible money savers. And we had 6 pairs of cars where we compared EVs to their gas car equivalent, and we compared their cost over an ownership period of 10 years. We've actually done this analysis before in our 2022 true cost report. You can find that on our website, but we have now updated these numbers. And on this slide, you see the comparison between the Chevrolet Bolt and the Toyota Corolla hatchback. And even though the Bolt is more expensive at the dealership, although now with the average Canada rebate, you already see that the sticker price is getting really close. Even though it is more expensive at the dealership, the Bolt, you start saving from the first kilometer. The per kilometer cost of driving the Toyota Corolla is almost twice as high. So that means that that difference in upfront cost, you will earn back in 8 months. And from that moment on, you are saving with every kilometer you drive up to $33,600 over a 10-year ownership period. And we found this for every model we compared out of the 6 pairs. So even if you want to drive a Ford F-150 truck, the electric model pays off actually faster than the previous comparison. The exact savings actually really depend per province and territory. So the previous slides showed a Canada-wide average. So we did compare all of the pairs of vehicles in every province and every territory and found that the EV wins out every time. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we found that the biggest savings were in provinces that have provincial rebates that you can stack on top of the federal ones, and in the provinces that have relatively cheaper electricity. So Quebec and BC being the front runners on this. But again, even in the provinces without a provincial rebate, electric models still come out cheaper. It's a very quick recap of the work we've done in this Clean Bill report. And of course, this is a positive story amid the affordability crisis. And it's good to know that clean energy is not only good for our planet, but also for household budgets. But we do need to make sure that these savings are available to all households in Canada. And in particular, we found that there are currently a lot of good options for people who own their homes and for people who can afford to pay a little bit more upfront to save in the long run. But those might not actually be the people who could gain the most from clean energy savings. So in our report, we also list some recommendations on how we could bring these savings home for every Canadian. And in particular, those focus on improving affordability, enhancing accessibility, and empowering customers. I'm really happy to answer any questions about those recommendations or the details of the math we did on these hypothetical households. But for now, I'll hand it over to Sarah from the Canadian Climate Institute to dive into heat pumps a little bit deeper.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jana. So as Trevor mentioned at the outset, we've recently undertaken a study looking at how the costs of heat pumps stack up against alternative heating and cooling systems across the country. So I'll speak a little bit to our results and then briefly on some of our recommendations that we make for overcoming other barriers that still might be holding people back from adopting a heat pump. So we undertook this study because, as we know, as we've seen in recent months, interest in heat pumps is really growing quickly, but there is still a lot of misinformation or inconsistent information that people are having to wade through as they make decisions to replace their heating and cooling systems. So we felt that closing this information gap, helping to provide some more detailed costing numbers in the Canadian context, could help give people more confidence and understand the different options and the cost savings that different technology mixes might be able to provide. So this is obviously important, not only because, as I'll talk about, we can see that heat pumps can save people a substantial amount of money on their home heating and cooling energy bills, but we also know that heat pumps are a really powerful tool in reducing emissions from homes and buildings. So modeling that our 440 team has done has shown that the uptake of heat pumps, their share of home heating, needs to double before 2030 in order to bring the building sector in line with a net zero pathway to be net zero by 2050. So while we are seeing accelerating uptake, there's still a fair ways to go to meet that target. And of course, because heat pumps can provide cooling as well as heating, they're a really critical tool in providing more protection from extreme heat and building resilience to extreme heat, critically in a way that doesn't actually make the problem worse. Whereas we know with traditional air conditioning, that when a household installs a central air conditioner, it tends to lock them into fossil fuel heating infrastructure, whereas a heat pump can provide both clean heating and cooling so that you're protecting people from the impacts of climate change at the same time as you're helping to deal with the causes. So we took an approach that really tried to paint a picture of what households can expect in different cities across the country and in different building types. So we looked at 5 cities across the country: Vancouver, Edmonton, Toronto, Montreal, and Halifax. And these are cities that we chose that have different gas and electricity prices, as well as a different mix of climates. We looked at 4 different building types, from single detached to townhouse to multi-unit buildings, 3 ages, starting from the older vintages, 1940s through to 1980s. And then also we looked at new builds, so built in 2023. And we looked at 4 different equipment configurations. So our baseline case, business as usual, was a gas furnace with a central air conditioner. And then we looked at 3 heat pump configurations. So a heat pump with gas backup, with electric backup, and then a cold climate heat pump with electric backup. And just a note on how we present our results. So we present our results as lifetime costs, presented as average annual costs. So we did this to enable a comparison between different technologies that can have different upfront costs, different lifespans, and different operating costs. So this enables a like-for-like comparison. We also applied different sensitivities for installation, equipment, and energy prices to allow for a range of possibilities. So we looked at high and low gas and electricity prices, as well as medium and high heat pump capital costs, to provide a range of numbers that people can expect. And then we also tended to make conservative assumptions on heat pumps. So we assumed high interest rates and only a slight decrease in current interest rates over time, which matters more for heat pumps because they have a higher upfront cost. And we also assumed a backup heating system is always installed. And obviously, there's been a fair bit of discussion around heat pump performance in the cold. This was a conservative assumption that we made to make sure that we were accounting for colder climates, but we also applied this in warmer climates. So we applied this, for example, in Vancouver, even with a cold climate heat pump. So some of our key results, we found, first of all, that heat pumps are already the lowest cost option for most households across the country. As you can see in this graph, in over 2/3 of cases, a heat pump with electric backup is cheaper than a gas furnace with central air conditioning. This is particularly true. They're particularly cost effective for single family homes and for townhouses. And this is true across building ages. It's also true in most of the cities we modeled. So Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and Halifax all see a heat pump with electric backup almost always cheaper than a gas furnace with air conditioning. Our second major finding is that the primary driver of differences that we see across the cities that we looked at are regional energy prices and climate conditions. And these factors are more important than building age or type. So for example, in Edmonton, heat pumps with gas backup or a traditional gas furnace and air conditioner tend to be the cheapest option. This is primarily because of Edmonton's very low gas prices relative to electricity prices, as well as the cold climate, which drives up electricity demand. In the other cities that we looked at, so in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and Halifax, heat pumps with electric backup tend to be the cheapest, even under the worst case assumptions that we can make for heat pumps. So even under assumptions of high upfront cost, high electricity prices, and low gas prices. Third, we found that existing policy and programming supports the cost competitiveness of heat pumps for households across the country. Jana spoke to this a little bit in some of their results on EVs and for households in Ontario. So we found that existing policy, this includes the carbon price and the schedule of planned increases out to 2030, as well as existing provincial and federal rebates, so notably the federal Greener Homes program, are important in making heat pumps the cheapest option. I will say, though, that this is not a uniform story across the country. So in some places, in Montreal and in Halifax, we find that heat pumps tend to be the cheapest option, even if you take away those rebates. But in other cities, so in Toronto and then in particular in Edmonton, rebates and the carbon price are necessary to make them the cheapest option for many household configurations. And then finally, as I've touched on before, we found that all electric scenarios, so where a heat pump is paired with electric backup, tend to be the cheapest option for households, rather than a heat pump paired with a gas backup system. And just a note that it's freezing a little for me. There we go. In addition to releasing a report recently, we also have an online calculator that we've launched. The website is heatpumpcalculator.ca, where you can go and you can put in a specific city, building age, building type, and then toggle on and off different assumptions around gas prices, electricity prices, equipment cost, and you get a detailed breakdown of the numbers for all the different equipment configurations. And we're looking to expand this calculator in the coming weeks as well to include more cities. So I'll just briefly speak to some of the barriers that we've identified. So our results show, and they're consistent with the results of other studies, that heat pumps are the best choice in almost all cases from purely an economic perspective, but we do know that there are other barriers holding people back. So the first is consumer confidence. So this is really about the fact that heat pumps are still a relatively unfamiliar technology for many people, and there is a lack of clear information and consistent information. And this is a particular challenge because often people are making heating and cooling replacement decisions with a high degree of urgency when existing equipment is failing. So you really need to be clear about what your options are and what you want if you're going to make that kind of a switch under those circumstances. We also found that while the lifetime cost of heat pumps are the lowest cost option, and that it only takes a couple of years in most cases to repay the higher upfront costs with lower operating costs, that they do have relatively higher upfront costs than a gas furnace and air conditioning. And this matters because households tend to weigh upfront costs more heavily in making these sorts of decisions. And people don't have all of the information always necessary to make a decision around operating costs that can take into account changes in fossil fuel prices and electricity prices. And then our final two barriers that we've identified in particular are the complexity and kind of cumbersome nature of existing programming and structural barriers that limit access for many households. So while we found that existing rebates at the federal and provincial levels are effective in bringing down costs, we also know that they can be extremely challenging and time-consuming to navigate, where you have different eligibility criteria, different wait times, and often the requirement to carry the costs up front before you get reimbursed later. In addition, we know that there are structural barriers that hold back many households. In particular, most of the rebates are geared towards single-family homes and owner-occupied households. So renters and people living in condos in particular may be locked out of the cost savings and the resilience benefits that heat pumps can provide. And I'm out of time, so I won't speak to these recommendations in detail, but happy to answer questions. So we've made a suite of recommendations essentially aimed at broadening out access for this technology and maintaining current policies and rebates to support adoption in the near term, even as we see uptake accelerating, and to help people make their way through the existing rebate, the programming that exists, and make things simpler for people. So I will leave it there. Thank you so much. And I will hand off, I believe, to Brendan, but I might be wrong.
It's Brendan. Yeah, I was just going to say thanks, Sarah. That was great. And Brendan, you're up.
Thanks so much, Trevor. Yeah, really pleased to be here today discussing this topic with you. I'm going to start really high level by thinking about when we think about the shape of net zero energy systems in the future. What's really exciting is that there's entirely new ways to deliver affordability. But I think to see that, we need to break out of some of the habits that we have from our centralized energy past and really focus on the demand side and on customers. So one thing that we can think about is the energy infrastructures of, say, the last century. They developed alongside an implicit, social bargain with customers. And that was, I would say, governments or private companies would control large centralized energy generation and customers would pay low prices. And that social bargain, I think, is starting to break down because centralized energy generation is getting expensive, whether it is a gas plant or a hydroelectric plant. And if we just try to build, say, a net zero grid by only making it bigger, that also could be quite expensive. And this was highlighted in a recent study in the US that showed that it would cost $100 billion more per year in that country to hit zero carbon electricity without energy efficient buildings and without active management of when and where energy demand occurs. So that's showing, hey, power plants and transmission lines, they're pretty costly, but we can avoid significant cost by instead investing in energy savings, as well as storage and self-generation that's located in our communities and our buildings. And so that not only makes that entire energy system lower cost and more affordable, but by focusing on those demand side solutions, it also opens up the possibility for an entirely new interaction with customers, a new social bargain. And that could look like making energy efficiency easy and accessible for everyone. And so that the way we achieve affordability is through lower bills, through very low energy demand. And when we're in a world where what really matters for accessing, warmth, light, entertainment is more coming from energy efficiency than, say, the fuel you're burning in your basement, paying a rate per unit of consumption might not make a lot of sense anymore. Customers could be paying stable fees for energy services, and they could be getting rewarded for being even more energy efficient because that avoids those more costly supply side options for everyone. And a second opportunity is for customers to get paid for offering services to future energy grids, services that were traditionally provided by, say, power plants. So as we rely more on wind, solar energy, traditional base load generation, it's going to become less important. And the ability to flexibly ramp up and down to match demand with those renewables is going to increase in value. And it's very likely to cost less and be more equitable to achieve that grid flexibility with customers. So for instance, your hot water tank can be heated overnight and you can still have hot water for the shower. Your electric vehicle can be charged during the lowest cost time for the grid and still have a full charge for the drive to work, right? And so that relationship of just paying a bill to a utility can change into one where people also get paid to allow their electricity using equipment to service the grid. And I think it makes a lot more sense to pay people, especially those with high energy burdens, than paying, power plant owners. So if we want to get to that kind of new affordability opportunity, we need to make these demand side solutions readily available at large scale. And as Sarah was just talking about, we're not going to do that in the way we run energy efficiency programs today. Today, every measure has to pass through a cost benefit test or a cost per ton test. From a policy perspective, we need to say, hey, we've got a net zero end goal, and we need to work backwards to change the costs and to change the market structures to meet that goal. If we think about the customer perspective today, there is a very confusing array of contractors and technologies, and it's largely the responsibility of the customer to undertake a rather complex and technical retrofit project. And that is certainly not the most productive way to do things. So we got to start exploring some new approaches, and those can include, say, working upstream a bit more. So for instance, we could implement regulations, we could implement incentive systems so that when anyone goes and buys, a hot water tank, it is automatically smart and it comes alongside, say, a contract that customers can opt into for the utility to start paying them for that tank to be used as thermal energy storage. We need to look at neighborhood-based retrofits with bulk contracting of people, with materials, so that we can have economies of scale. We need to look at the strategic timing of upgrade needs across several buildings at once, so we can match those supply side resources and pool together, similar retrofit needs. The other thing we could encourage is explore what's called efficiency as a service business models. A customer would see no upfront cost, and they would instead, that upfront cost would be replaced by a regular payment, and the people actually doing the work would be responsible for real energy savings performance instead of, say, customers taking on that risk right now. So next, I want to talk about affordability where it matters the most, which is low-income homeowners and renters who are struggling with energy costs right now. And we know that, affordability challenges today, they're not just about energy, but they are connected because people will tend to pay their energy bills before meeting other needs. So by reducing energy costs, we free up funds so that people can spend it on food or they can spend it on prescription drugs. And right now, latest data is saying that 20% of low-income households are not spending on basic needs because of their energy bills. When we think about tenants experience energy poverty. They might not even pay a bill, but they are vulnerable to dangerous heat events because of poor building performance. So energy affordability, it's interconnected with all these other cost pressures and the impacts of climate change. And so today, a big climate policy injustice is that the federal government has no solution for the vast majority of low-income Canadians to improve their energy efficiency. So the existing federal programs require participants to pay upfront and then wait to access a grant later or access a loan. And if you're someone with low income or fixed income, it's not possible to cover those upfront costs. It doesn't really matter how good of a long-term investment is or how high the carbon tax is. So there's been some recent advancements that shows that the federal government understands this is an issue. So they are now paying the upfront cost for heat pumps for oil heated homes. And this was just recently bolstered alongside the controversial carbon tax exemption announcement. But the majority of low-income Canadians actually heat with electricity, or they heat with natural gas, or they heat with other fuels. And there's still no help from the federal government for them. The oil program is also restricted to heat pumps. And heat pumps are super cool. They've really captured people's imagination. But for many homes, a straight heat pump installation, it's a great solution, but it's not the sole solution to solve people's affordability, comfort, and health problems. A lot of oil heated homes in this country are really old and leaky. And so a program with some flexibility to also do some air sealing or basic home repairs or things like mold removal would make those heat pumps work better and actually solve people's affordability problems. When we think about certain regions of the country, I mean, if you put a heat pump on an uninsulated building in Alberta right now, you could increase that person's bills in the immediate term. And that's not a responsible policy for low-income Canadians. Insulation will reduce those bills immediately, and you still might want that heat pump to provide that long-term security and affordability. So we need to make sure that everyone can access the benefits of energy efficiency, and that requires a portfolio of approaches, which includes breaking down those low-income specific barriers and not excluding low-income Canadians from the full spectrum of energy efficiency solutions, or excluding them because they don't heat with the right fuel. So I started really high level, and I want to end with something immediate and concrete. If we really care about affordability, let's retrofit the low-income homes. That should be a high priority. And if you agree with me on that, there's a petition we have that you can sign, there's letters you can write. And so thanks for taking the time to explore this topic with us today.
All right, thanks, Brendan. All right, next up, last but not least, we have Louise.
Hi, everybody. Good to have you here, and thanks for attending this webinar. If you haven't heard of ReClimate before, we're a center for training, research, and strategy on climate communications at Carleton University, and reach out anytime. I wanted to talk about the context within which we are communicating our story about affordability. We've already talked a lot about the issues of cost of living and affordability, but what you might not realize is that these particular concerns trigger security values. Security values help make us be a little bit more self-referencing. They kind of they dampen our social values. And you're seeing that at the moment in terms of people looking to how can I deal with my particular sets of issues. And it is having an effect on people's willingness to support climate policy. And so because they're preoccupied, and they're preoccupied in a way dealing with security concerns, we are seeing that this is a very challenging communication environment, and our messaging around efficiency and affordability may only take us so far. So I'm going to show you an example of what I mean about this challenging communication environment. This is the results of a survey that I did with the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, and we have been monitoring, we have a survey, we explain what the clean electricity regulation is in the survey, of course, and then we have ask people to identify whether they think it's fair. And you might wonder why I test fairness perceptions. I do that because when we ask about support and oppose, we may not necessarily understand what people are actually thinking about. And so generally what I've learned in my research, especially on carbon pricing, is that people evaluate policies through the lens of fairness. And at the moment, we've got about 35% of the population that actually think, in this case, the clean electricity regulation is fair, and the equal amount thinking it's unfair. Now, we're in an environment where we've got a lot of conflicting stories being told, but what concerns me is that the perception of fairness is down 14% from the year before. And the number of people that think it's unfair is up 10%. And so this issue of what's going on, oh, I don't know what's going on right there. Let's just see, there we are. In terms of people's distractedness is really playing out in their support for policies. We see the same thing here on whether or not people will accept a policy. They might not like a policy, like they don't like carbon pricing. They've never liked carbon pricing, but they were willing to accept it. We've, as the great language that Brendan's used about the social bargain, we're really in trouble around the social bargain on carbon pricing. And what we see here as well is that we have some social goodwill in terms of being willing to accept it. 51% say it's acceptable. But that's down 11% from last year. Unacceptability is up 7%. And so we're seeing this kind of retrenchment on the part of the public. And it does relate to affordability. We always ask in terms of thinking about their electricity, you know, what's more important to you? Affordability, reliability, environmentally sustainable. And about 30% of the sample, of which was 2,000 people, and we did this survey in early October, we're not sure. But of those who were willing to answer, almost half of them said affordability was most important, and then followed by reliability and environmental sustainability. But we asked the people who raised the issue as most important to them as being affordable, whether or not energy efficiency programs in their minds, what they, you know, to the degree you know about existing programs and so on, does that make the idea of a clean electricity regulation more affordable to you? And in this context, what we see is you really have a muted response. And this is partly why I'm saying about needing to take care not to overstate. People think it could make it somewhat more affordable. We have a good third thinking not more affordable. And about 20%, 24% thinking that it would be more affordable or much more affordable. So, you know, making the claim that it is more affordable needs obviously to be supported. But at the moment, people are not like jumping and saying, oh, of course, it's going to make it way more affordable. The other thing that's happening in terms of the public reality, the communications reality, is that we see a long-term trend in decline in trust in institutions. And that's a challenge for us when we need governments to do stuff. And we need them to do stuff on affordability and on climate change regulations. At the moment, and this is a result consistent with other surveys I've done and seen, more than half of Canadians trust friends and family most when it comes to information about electricity. And so the question is, how do we engage all the people we know who are our friends and family who maybe have been through a program and have put in a heat pump? How do we create shared meaning and have these people actually become ambassadors for the opportunities? I also wanted to share with you that we did a test on two narratives. I'm not going to read these to you, but the narrative on the right is essentially the narrative that says that climate action makes our lives unaffordable. The narrative on the left says is the story we're telling on how climate action makes our lives affordable. And what we found is that over half the population actually at least slightly to strongly agrees that climate policies make their life unaffordable. About 62% believe the story about it being more affordable. And so you obviously can tell there's some overlap there, people agreeing with both. But it does speak to the reality that the message about climate action being unaffordable is gaining hold, and we shouldn't be ignoring that. We do need to counter that with the story and a vision that we are proposing. Just trying to advance this here as we want to go. Okay. Let me just go back one. I've only got a couple of slides here. So in terms of the story we're telling, you know, good story structure is going to have a challenge and a choice to be made and the opportunities for us to grasp. And so the challenge is, you know, the world is changing. We need clean electricity and climate action makes our life more affordable. But as been mentioned here, people are not confident in the solutions. And when we have weak agency like that, it does mean that people are vulnerable to misinformation. That's why the studies that are being done are so important. The question is, how do we get it into the hands of people, and how do we use this reality that friends and family are the most trusted, and that institutions are least trusted. We also need to be more visual in our language because, of course, people are reading quickly. We put out a lot of good technical reports, but we've really got to remember that it's the visual dynamic, not just the tech, but the people interacting with the tech that matters. And then finally, I wanted just to remind us, because we all are a bit geeky in our own comms, and Trevor's really good at always making sure we remember this. When we're talking about our opportunities here, the language around good, stable jobs, or people, putting people at the heart and thinking about fairness and so on, talking about communities, talking about nature, forests, and that kind of protection, not talking low carbon, but talking pollution free. Not talking mitigation and emissions, but pollution and the heat trapping blanket and so on, that we really do want to have language that is accessible to people and not, kind of our own language on the inside game. And so let me just close off by saying, that we do need to reflect people's lived experience, that especially 45 to 59-year-old people right now are very, very seized by the affordability concern. We shouldn't forget the question of reliability and the highlighting benefits to health and nature and future generations. That's declining in terms of what people believe, and I think that's a challenge for us right now. 70% of Canadians are concerned about the effects on low income. So Brendan is on to I think, an important issue crosses political lines. Savings benefits, of course, are important, but I also think that price stability is another issue. The whole issue of security and being able to just cope with things and knowing what your bills are going to be is another big issue. And the concern I have is I don't want us to overstate these programs without also addressing the fact that we have long waiting lists in these programs, that, as we've mentioned already, that it's difficult sometimes to navigate them. And so we want to be clear about the fact that we have to make it easier for people and we have to clear those black backlogs. And then I want to also talk about the fact, finally, as I close, that the consumer focus that we're focused on today is important, but so is getting industry to do more of its fair share. The public really is perceiving right now that these policies are chasing them and not chasing the bigger polluters, and they feel that it's a little bit unwarranted and unfair. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Louise, Brendan, Sarah, Jana, and Trevor for those fab presentations. So yeah, I'm just going to welcome back all of our panelists now, and we'll have a period of time for questions. We've already had some great questions in the Q&A, so thank you, and do keep them coming. We're compiling them, and we've got about 25 minutes to ask questions now. So I've just got a few questions here just to kick things off. I'm going to send this first question to Trevor, but other panelists, feel free to jump in as well if you've got stuff you want to add on. So Trevor, is there a risk of overpromising these benefits as a solution to affordability generally? EVs and heat pumps won't be an affordability solution for everyone.
Yeah, no, and I think Louise and Brendan and others spoke to that, and that's really important. I guess the one thing I'd say as a communicator, when you're speaking on morning radio, for example, is to remember who you're speaking to and where they're starting from. I think there's a tendency among people like us researchers to just start with all the disclaimers, like we're speaking to our colleagues, and you don't want to do that when you're speaking to the public, because a truth poorly communicated can actually move people closer toward the lie. So, the truth might be over here in terms of what clean energy means for affordability, broadly speaking. And if people are over here, you want to make sure that what you're saying is inching people closer to the truth. And so from that perspective, you should make sure that you're, emphasizing your key messages, the things they don't realize yet, and really hammering those things home, before you go down the rabbit hole of disclaimers. So, I mean, definitely we want to be aware of our limitations of not overpromising things. But again, I mean, they're listening to the opposition leader and premiers going on every single day saying climate policy makes life unaffordable. And they have all these biases toward the status quo being easier and more affordable, even when it's not. Biases toward an upfront cost over long-term savings. So just have all that in the back of your mind and work toward moving them closer to the truth as you're saying the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the questions that we've had crop up quite a few times in the Q&A, and I'm going to send this one to Sarah because it's about heat pumps. So as you know, research has shown like heat pumps are a great solution for only owner-occupied detached homes. But what can we do to improve the equity of access to heat pumps for other parts of the population, like renters or people living in condos, for example?
For sure. Thanks for the question. Yeah, this is super important, particularly given the need to really build resilience to extreme heat and the fact that many of the people who are the most vulnerable to extreme heat may be lower income in apartment buildings, older apartment buildings in particular. And as you said, they may be the least able to access heat pump technologies because the eligibility for most of the rebate programs are restricted to single family homes and owner-occupied households. And renters in particular, it's a big challenge because there's this misaligned incentive between landlords who tend to pay for the installation of the system and then renters who tend to pay for the actual operating costs. So this is a real challenge. I think there's a few different pieces. Some of the things that we've recommended in our report, first of all, when you're looking at new buildings, it's a no-brainer that we need to have maximum temperature limits now in building codes for all new buildings, as well as requirements for active cooling, in addition to design measures like passive cooling to ensure that we can keep homes at a safe and comfortable level. Our homes in Canada have been designed to keep people warm, not to keep people cool, and this is something that really needs to change urgently. I think one of the pieces with requiring space cooling is that we need to ensure that there's synergy between that side of things, so that sort of adaptation measure, and the need to ensure clean heating and electrification of buildings. So you can pair requirements for space cooling with a requirement that it also be 100% energy efficient and be able to provide clean heating. So that's one powerful thing. Looking at retrofits, I mean, Brendan spoke a lot about this. The biggest challenge is older buildings, multi-unit buildings, and existing rental stock. So we think governments really need to have a dedicated strategy to get clean heating and cooling into these buildings. There's a bunch of different pieces. So Nova Scotia, for example, has a dedicated rebate program for multi-unit buildings with specific affordability criteria. That's one way that you could go. Hamilton is looking at a bylaw, as I'm sure many know, to require a maximum indoor temperature limit, including for existing buildings, that will trigger an obligation to provide cooling and to make sure those buildings are safe. There's also direct government to consumer programs. BC has some with air conditioning. So there are different things that you can do, but we really need to ensure that focus on ensuring that the existing stock is safe for people to live in.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So I've got one sort of high level question about communicating affordability and climate issues, which is maybe I'll send this one to Louise. You've already spoken a lot about this, but perhaps you could kind of summarize it all for us. What do you think is the biggest obstacle to communicating the link between affordability and climate solutions right now in Canada? And how can we overcome the challenge?
I think the biggest challenge is misinformation. People really don't have confidence in the solutions. They don't know what the really most effective solutions are. And so the reality is that when you are in doubt about a solution, and there's a gap right now in the information, social media space, if you will, what's coming to people is the misinformation. The other thing is people seem to be bringing in a lot of information that allows them to kind of rationalize why this is not the solution for me. And so I wouldn't normally be so fixated on countering misinformation and disinformation, but I actually think we really need to. I think we're in a situation where there's a vulnerability that we need to address, and the material we're working with here and the things we're talking about is important to that. The question is how to get it to people, and how to get it to people from people who people trust is the second area that we've got to figure out. And I know Trevor's going to jump in.
Oh, I totally agree. It's we've been doing myth busting, actually put an EV myth buster this year that got a lot of traction, and it seems to be spinning up a lot more. I feel like something becomes more mainstream, the backlash also increases, and that's what we're seeing. And I think we're going to start seeing it with heat pumps now because they've just broken into the mainstream.
Yeah, I feel like we're already seeing quite a lot of heat pump related misinformation around there as well, and a lot of legitimate concerns too, but also misinformation interspersed with it. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of switch gears a little bit on the questions. Question for Brendan. So sort of a jobs-based question, I guess. So you mentioned a lot of retrofit work that we need to do, especially if we want to make, solutions like heat pumps actually effective and affordable for people. So how do we find people to do the retrofit work?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think the key thing is that we're not going to find people to do the retrofit work and help people build careers in that space, stable careers with good jobs, by disrupting or reducing demand. What we need is like steady, predictable demand. And that's why it's quite important that, for instance, the Greener Homes program continues and is not disrupted without, some sort of alternative replacement. But a low-income energy efficiency program in particular is really uniquely qualified to help also build capacity within the renovation sector. And that's because, the whole retrofit process is basically guided from start to finish. So those programs in a lot of jurisdictions play a really valuable role for contractors because the retrofits are timed to shoulder seasons. So like the fall and spring, a lot of contractor businesses end up laying people off at that time. And those retrofits can be strategically timed to smooth out that demand that contractors experience. The other thing is we want more people from traditionally disadvantaged communities to enter the trades. And doing that through a low-income program doubles as a way to get participation, because people from lower income communities trust if people they know are doing the work. So a low-income program is actually really uniquely qualified to actually play this much larger role in helping build up the renovation capacity.
It's really interesting. Okay, and then so now I've just got returning again to sort of affordability solutions. I've just got a question for Jana. So we talked a lot about rebates. We know that rebates are really important for helping with upfront costs. But what if in a hypothetical situation, if these rebates run out or we get a government that scraps rebates, are the clean energy solutions still going to be cheaper? How does the math work?
Yeah, I think Sarah spoke a little bit about the heat pumps and rebates, and in a lot of places, the electric heat pump with backup is still a cost saver even without the rebate, but in other places it is not. And we also ran the numbers for EVs and found that over a 10-year ownership period, they are still cheaper without the rebate. However, I think what a lot of the others have spoken to is that it's not just about these savings over the long term. It's also about making these savings accessible. And we don't want these solutions to be a luxury product that you can only access if you have a bag of cash laying around. And not everyone has the financial breathing room to make that upfront investment. So we need to reduce that initial hurdle. And a rebate does that. A rebate brings down that upfront cost. So that's why they're, I think, a very important policy.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I'm just gonna move on to a question that I've seen pop up a lot of times, kind of a version of the same question. And Sarah, you've actually sort of answered most of this question already, but seeing as we've had so many people ask it, I'm just going to ask it more specifically. So a lot of people saying that they're finding they've got barriers to installing heat pumps in their house, particularly when it comes to electrical upgrades. and other kind of upgrades that are needed. So, you know, are there, you mentioned a few, but are there any kind of real specific policy solutions or programs or other solutions that you'd recommend to help people at the moment overcome those issues? It's also an issue that I've had personally in our house as well. Like, the electrical issues can really be a barrier for some.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question. I think there's a few different types of barriers that people face. I think you're speaking more to the sort of technical side, which really varies, and particularly can come up in older homes. So we chose to apply the cost of panel upgrades in all of our modeling for older homes and in regions where you don't have high air conditioning uptake already. So we assumed pretty conservative need for a panel upgrade, because we know that that's something that a lot of people face. The extent to which those are covered by rebates varies across the country. So in BC, you can get a rebate to cover at least part of the electrical upgrade cost, but that isn't the case in all provinces. So that's definitely something to look at in terms of eligibility for rebate programs, to ensure people aren't surprised with that additional cost and then they're not getting coverage for it. In other cases, I would say one of the things that we did find in our research that is a little bit counter to some of the kind of prevailing information out there is that we didn't find much of a difference between older homes, so homes in that 1940s vintage, and the new builds in terms of whether heat pumps are cost competitive. Instead, what we found is that savings for all technologies go up in newer homes because they're more efficient. But heat pumps are still tend to be the cheapest option in older homes. So even though you do have, potentially it's a little bit less well insulated, or you have a little bit more complexity in installation, we still found that they can be a good economical choice. But I will say that, talking to trusted installers and contractors is really important, as people's individual circumstances vary. We know that. So maybe I'll leave it there. I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to add on the practical side.
Can I just chime in with two things? I mean, so there are solutions, like there's load misers, for instance, which can help you manage the peak loads on your own home. So there are solutions other than straight electrical upgrades, but I think it's a really good example of, especially in some of the programs, they tend to be limited to just energy, whereas sometimes like non-energy upgrades are the barrier to better energy efficiency in heat pumps. So for instance, if there's mold in someone's walls, or if you need a door replaced, like these are big issues, especially in low income homes, that especially federal funds, which don't have the same restrictions as say a utility, could really do a lot of good. And the electrical panel upgrade is one of those examples as well.
So kind of related to that, someone is asking, maybe Brendan, you can speak to this. So if we retrofit low-income homes, will a lot of these be rented? And therefore, will the benefits go to the landlords in high-value homes? So, will then rents go up as a result? So we kind of know that there is a split incentive issue with this. So it might be that the landlord pays the cost, might not pay the bills, but then is there also an equity issue on the other side of that means that that needs to be addressed?
That's a great question, and I think I put a link to a whole brief we have on this, but I'll love to talk about it. Is yes, we hear this concern, and there could be really perverse things happening, like, oh, if we make the buildings too good, by making them more comfortable and healthy, we might end up increasing the rents or having evictions, right? But the answer to that is not to have an adequate housing quality. The answer to that is smart policy and program design. So what they do in the United States, low income efficiency program, for example, is if you have low income tenants, you get no cost upgrades to those units or to those buildings. And in return, the landlord must sign an affordability covenant, which is a contract between the tenant, the program administrator, and the landlord to essentially maintain affordable rents to maintain, to protect against evictions, and to protect against, sort of frivolous upgrades, and to even have a dispute resolution mechanism with the tenant. So if we can do it that way, if we can have these affordability covenants coupled with the retrofit projects, we actually flip it into a way to maintain the affordability of our existing housing stock, while helping to upgrade those for health and safety and energy efficiency.
Thanks, Brendan. So we've had a couple of questions about electric vehicles, and specifically around the environmental impacts of EVs, switching to EVs. So Trevor or whoever, I just know that this is some work that we've done at Clean Energy Canada, but anyone else feel free to jump into. Can you speak to the impact of EV manufacturing and their batteries compared to gas cars, and maybe the role of recycling as well?
But yeah, sure. I'll just kick it off. If anyone else can jump in if they'd like. So we actually did put out that EV Mythbuster. If you Google "countering common myths about electric vehicles, Clean Energy Canada," you'll find it because it's the first question we tackle. I'll just summarize it. A number of studies have shown that the life cycle emissions of an EV beats out a gas car pretty much everywhere, even in a situation where you have a really dirty grid. That's generally not the case in Canada. Our electricity grid is about 84% not emitting. Of course, it's going to be worse in a place like Alberta than a place like BC, where it's like close to 99, right? But no matter where you are, it's cleaner. And there is, of course, the mining aspect and the shipping aspect, and that side of the life cycle emissions. But it's worth pointing out that people often focus on the mining impact of electric vehicles, but the mining impact of extractive fossil fuel production, hugely outweighs the mining that's going to go into EVs. And I think it's important to remember as well that some of the emissions that's happening is still happening because of fossil fuels and the shipping or the mining side of things, right? So we need to electrify the supply chain that goes into building EVs as well, but that's not going to happen unless we also adopt a lot more EVs, right? These things, when you're buying an EV, it's about the emissions reductions of that individual vehicle, but it's also about incentivizing the larger transformation to technologies that don't rely on fossil fuels. And that's going to help spur innovation throughout the supply chain and further decarbonization. So, yeah, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to jump in on this because it's really great example of the solutions denialism piece of it. And I just want to make sure that we don't fall into a communications trap where we also participate in what the philosophers call exonerative comparison, where we say, yeah, our thing is better than that thing. Well, actually, the reality is that the mining industry needs to be regulated to produce the materials it needs to produce in ways that are environmentally responsible. We need to recycle and have closed loop manufacturing. And if you haven't seen the Ford 150 analysis that's in the National Observer a couple of days ago, and all of the materials, it is stunning how much material and the shock and awe of that vehicle and the rare earths that it's using. Not everybody, we're not solving climate change if everybody has an electric vehicle. Let's get a grip. We need many alternatives to single family vehicles and transit and all of those kinds of things, or we should electrify first, perhaps. So the issue of responsibility is I think a fundamental principle, and it should be core to our communications. But I would just challenge us all to remember to watch, am I participating in exonerative comparison? Because it's just like, oh yeah, well, my car is, no, everybody's got to do their bit. We're not letting mining off or you manufacturing off the hook.
Yeah, there's one study that says that battery recycling could eventually, reduce mining by upwards of 40% by 2050. And it's a huge opportunity for Canada as well. There are some mining companies here, so it's a huge part of it. And of course, reducing car use, reducing car size. It's unfortunate that I think a lot of new EVs, some of them are maybe bigger than they need to be, is another challenge that's an uphill battle in North America, unfortunately.
Yeah, as a Brit, when I first moved here, I was surprised at the vehicle sizes. I've got quite a lot of questions about heat pumps coming in, so I'm just going to switch it back to heat pumps from electric vehicles, particularly around the use of heat pumps in Canadian cold, and also the use of backups for heat pumps as well. So, Sarah, could you speak to whether or not backups are always necessary? And I think we've had 2 or 3 questions with people asking if they can use their existing gas furnace as a backup, or whether or not they can be whether it has to be replaced.
For sure. Yeah, I was just typing out an answer in the chat on one of these questions, so this is great. I will answer here instead. So yeah, there's a few things there. I will say in our study, we made the conservative assumption to assume backup systems across the board, even though we know that they won't always be required. So in warmer parts of Canada, and particularly when you have a cold climate heat pump, which can perform effectively in very cold temperatures, you may not actually need a backup system, but it's going to vary based on where you are in the country and then the individual insurer's requirements. So we know that some, but not all insurers require backup, and it varies based on where you are. So I can't give a kind of universal answer to that. So in terms of performance in cold climates, and I saw a question on Manitoba, for example, when we looked at Edmonton, which was the city with the coldest climate in our study that we looked at in the first round, we did find that heat pumps with gas backup tend to be the cheapest option for most households. But likely you will need a backup system in some of the coldest parts of the country that will kick in during the coldest few days or weeks of the year to supplement the heat pump or replace the heating load. I will also note that cold climate heat pumps can work effectively down to temperatures around -25 degrees. And that the efficiency, so heat pumps are extremely efficient, and we do find that their efficiency, it drops as it gets colder, but it still holds, and they can still perform quite efficiently in cold climates. So you are still getting significant operating savings, even if you do end up using a backup system for the coldest few days or weeks of the year. So yeah, maybe I'll leave it there. It is sort of a regional story, and it does depend on where you are, but we do find that heat pumps can still meet that heating load and do so cost effectively in most climates. And we are expanding the number of cities that we're looking at as well to capture colder climates, to try and give people more specific information who might not be in the city centers that we initially looked at.
Thank you, Sarah. So we're rapidly running out of time. We have 1 minute left, and I've got one final question that I'm going to put to all the panelists. So you can jump in, whoever wants to answer it first. And I actually don't know the answer to this at all. So, but is there any research out there on how many homes and buildings are electrified across Canada? And are there any projections for the next 5 years?
I can try very quickly. I don't remember the statistic, but I think one thing we forget about in Canada is that a lot of people heat with electricity, and really inefficient electricity. And so replacing that with heat pumps is just a huge opportunity to save a whole bunch of electricity and save people a bunch of money.
That was an excellent and very succinct answer. I appreciate that.
There's StatsCan data on like heating types by household across Canada, across province. So you could take that, and then you could look at like EV registrations and come up with the sort of answer to that question, I think.
To be continued, sounds like. But so I think that's probably all we've got time for. Thank you so much for your questions. I'm really sorry if we didn't get a chance to answer them. Looks like we had almost 100 questions in the Q&A. Yeah, I want to thank you all again for joining us. Thank you in particular to our panelists for sharing all your wisdom with us. My colleague Kira is going to send an email shortly, which will include some resources, a webinar recording, and some of the slides that you saw today, as well as a quick survey. So I'd be really grateful if you could fill that out to give us your feedback on this webinar. So wherever you are, have a great rest of your afternoon, and keep fighting the good fight. Thanks, everyone.